Bankston. To just give a brief description of Dr. Bankston, Dr. Bankston is a scientist, advocate, and mentor at the intersection of research, higher education, science policy, and workforce development. By day, Dr. Bankston is a principal investigator analysis at the University of California Office of Federal Government Relations in Washington, D.C. And in addition to working at the University of California, Dr. Bankston is also the CEO and manager publisher of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, a fellow with advancing research impact in society, and a biomedical workforce and policy research investigator at the STEM Advocacy Institute. In a letter in recognition of her contributions to science policy and connecting science and society, Adriana was named among the top 50 women leaders of DC for 2022 and awarded the inaugural 2022 ARIS Emerging Border Impact Leader Award. So in this session, Dr. Bankston will be describing her career path from research into science policy, highlighting her experiences along the way, and she'll also be discussing ways to get involved in existing opportunities in the field. So without further ado, Dr. Bankston, take it away.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here and speak with you all. Let's see if I can share. Okay, so this will be a bit of a mix of a little background on policy, and then we'll go through some of my experiences. So yeah, thanks again for inviting me. So we'll start, so before I give any talk, I just have to say that this is my personal view and not my employer's, as I'm speaking here in a personal capacity. And so wanted to just start by a few broad concepts in science policy. I'm not sure how much exposure you all have had, but this is sort of one of the basics. How do we actually define science policy? So it's a set of federal rules, regulations, and methods, practices, and guidelines under which scientific research is conducted. And there are sort of two concepts, fundamental concepts: science for policy, which is how scientific findings can be used to develop public policy, which is what we typically think about when you think about policy. And the other side is, which is really where my background has been more in terms of policy for science. How do we think about affecting the practice of science, the research enterprise, what laws and regulations and policies regulate this? And some of this comes back to the university, and I'll go through sort of my path. But something to keep in mind also that obviously science and policy are interconnected, they influence each other, and it's sort of a bi-directional relationship to where you want to have evidence-based policy, but also policy can influence, again, the scientific practice. So I wanted to provide a few sort of background about where can you do science policy, right? So you sort of should pick an area that you're interested in. Obviously, I worked for university, but there's a lot of other places where this can be done. And just to highlight a few, and really the positions sort of differ between more research-based roles like at think tanks, universities, we do this. There's also a difference between policy and advocacy as well. Professional societies and nonprofits, again, they work in different areas of policy. And then funding agencies, NIH and NSF, biotech companies, of course, governments, and also Capitol Hill, which is really where sort of all the federal work happens, and in the state capitals as well. So if you're thinking about policy options, there are different places you can do this, and the sort of day-to-day looks different based on where you are. And then wanted to just give again idea of what these look like. So again, my role is legislative analyst. This is more or somewhat on the research side of things. You can be an analyst related to a specific area of policy like health policy. You can do programs. A lot of these sort of government roles are the program analyst. The second sort of area is communication, promoting science. So some of this is advocacy, public affairs, government relations, again, kind of fits into this bucket, as well as lobbying. If you want to organize programs, so again, a lot of government jobs are like this, sort of health policy, health program specialist, something like this. you'll see a lot of that. And then sort of more far removed or higher level roles would be policy advisors. Roles in government sometimes can be very high level and influencing a lot of different stakeholders, and then also working actually on the Hill, the Senate or House in an office or on a committee, which again, there's more influence and it's a different type of job on the Hill as well. So just some brief things to consider. What I also want to say is that as scientists, we need more scientists in policy, but as scientists, we understand how to analyze data, think about different areas of policy and bringing our data analysis skills to the table. We manage projects. And again, if you are involved in a research project, you know sort of what this is like. A lot of the day-to-day is very similar to what you've done in research. You manage projects, you train students and so on. You will develop some sort of expertise that is useful for policymakers, and they're looking for content and knowledge from scientists to bring to inform their policymaking. And so things to consider are that in policy, you really will be communicating with non-scientists, a lot of folks from a lot of backgrounds, which makes it interesting and also challenging to learn how to translate your research to different audiences, which is something that takes practice, but it's a good skill. And of course, thinking through who you're talking to, looking at the audience. Sometimes it is a policymaker, sometimes it's a federal or a state level. Different legislators have different interests in terms of specific policy areas. And you often have to put forth sort of a position on an area and build consensus among different groups to do that. So that's something that, again, takes a while, especially if you're advocating for a specific position on a policy area. And then the last two really just general things to consider: networking and professional relationships. A lot of the way that policy works is through meeting people, and when you're looking for a job, and just even before that, making sure that you are developing a network in the field, and those people can help you then when you're moving around and looking for jobs and so on. So happy to talk more about this, but just wanted to give a little kind of introduction to what to think about policy specifically. So we'll move now into my own path. So how did I get here? I am a scientist. I grew up in science. My parents are both faculty. I grew up in academic life pretty much my whole life. So I was sort of predestined to go into science, I guess. So I got my bachelor's from Clemson in biological sciences, pursued a PhD from Emory, again, biomedical sciences, and then did a brief postdoc at U of L in a different area of research. Can go into that if anyone's interested in sort of how I moved around and why I went to different places. But long story short, I sort of didn't think about really too many career paths. When I was in grad school, I was very focused on graduating and all the requirements to do that, and it was stressful in a way. And so when I got to my postdoc, which is sort of a full-time research position, I was more relaxed, started thinking about what other options I might have, how do I use my science, and really was not really interested in academia, probably about 6 months to a year into my postdoc. And so I started looking for opportunities to actually figure out my own path. And so U of L, they didn't have a lot of options in terms of career development programs, workshops, and seminars, and so on. And so we started this craft seminar, which essentially brings speakers to talk to postdocs about career options. They later added graduate students, and I'm showing here, we actually did have a couple of talks on science policy, which is really informative, and I didn't really know what this was at the time. But developing programs really made me interested in kind of improving the research system and providing opportunities for trainees when they're thinking about career options. And so I was sort of in this space of wanting to help them transition out and working on that. And so I networked with organizations that were sort of focused on training. So the National Postdoc Association, the Graduate Career Consortium, both have sort of university administrators thinking through how to train students and postdocs in different careers, to develop programs and workshops and so on. And so I was interested in that area. And then at the same time joined this postdoc committee at U of L, which was looking at policies at universities or in the university in terms of supporting postdocs and how do we improve policies internally, which sort of piqued my interest, but again, didn't really know what really policy work meant at the time. And then I was living in Kentucky, again, not a whole lot to do there. So I got involved with the Kentucky Academy of Sciences. We developed an award for societal change, which is sort of rewards scientists who do kind of outreach in the community. The award, I think they still have that. And then got involved a little bit in sort of some of their policy and education work and advocacy and so on. So really just dabbling a little bit into training and policy and still kind of straddling these two areas now as I've shifted from this. But my interest really, again, in academia started with looking at being interested in university policy. How do we change the system to improve, to help trainees transition and so on. So from here, let's see, there we go. One thing that sort of worked out really well actually is that when I left my postdoc, looking for ways to really impact universities, got involved with this nonprofit called Future of Research, and they essentially were very aligned with my interests in sort of helping trainees. They advocate for students and postdocs in the system. They publish work or publish papers on data from universities, which is still not very transparent. So here are a few things, and then try to use this data to push for changes in policies. And so this is one study that we did in 2016. There was a federal labor law mandating that postdoc salaries would increase. And we looked at sort of nationwide what this looked like. And so you can see the graph here, what they had decided that who is going to raise salaries across the US. And then we did another study looking at what salaries look like actually based on title, which is the graph on the right. So it's a little bit small, but basically shows the variation of postdoc pay across the US in a lot of universities, different types of schools. And the way that they're getting paid is quite variable based on what you call them, what you call a postdoc. And there's actually 11 different titles here. So that's fascinating. So this really was a good transition for me in thinking about, okay, so maybe policy change could be achieved actually, looking at universities more broadly, and then looking for a position that maybe would help to think about the research enterprise broadly and from a policy standpoint, not sort of the training standpoint, although I still do kind of training things. So I still think that's important. But this was a shift to thinking more about the research system from a policy standpoint from these research studies. So then the next thing was really my transition into the field was through my fellowship with Society for Neuroscience. This is similar to many fellowships that help PhD graduates transition. They sort of teach you how to write policy briefs and memos. We organized events to connect with legislators. And so obviously they advocate for neuroscience funding, animal research, those sorts of things that relate to neuroscience specifically. They organized a Capitol Hill Day, which is an organized event to bring researchers to the Hill, talk to legislators. It's very sort of crafted, different meetings with specific legislators during the day. And they advocate for specific things like budgets, particular talking points as well. But really all is around sort of why we need more funding for neuroscience. And that was a big part of the fellowship, is organizing this Hill Day sort of at the back end for the society, understanding how to connect researchers with policymakers. And then there were some other, a lot of communication, which is something I do now, but this is the first time I had done it. So one is the congressional testimony, which is what the SFN president would write to testify in Congress. They may or may not use that, but we write every year the document for them, again, saying how they essentially lobby for more neuroscience funding. So that is a specific type of document that you learn how to write in this sort of fellowship. The Advocacy Network newsletter. So this is, and again, this is a common thing where we essentially send a roundup of the latest policy issues at the federal level that the SFN members want to hear about. Some of it is budget related, again, or specific issues that, for example, the administration is looking at. Then we send out this newsletter every month. I think it was more frequent there, but it's a very common thing where you're sort of rounding up all of the latest policy for the membership. And the last thing, again, I'm showing here, this early career policy ambassadors. So they have I think it's for graduate students, training program. They come to Capitol Hill Day. So this is what this picture is here. They pick 10 to 12 students to come to DC. They do training, they do advocacy during the year. And this was actually nice because I got to review applications for the program. And that really, was a good crosstalk between my interest in training and policy and really helping students transition and come to DC to be part of the Hill Day that I was organizing. But SFN also does a lot of things for their early career members. So if you're interested in this, may look at membership for SFN. But overall, it was a really good fellowship. I learned a lot about how things work on the Hill, did some writing, did this ECPA program applications and so on. And so good sort of overall experience here. But it was only a 6 month fellowship. And so not to prolong this too much, but I needed to find a job while I was also in this fellowship. So I moved cross country, came to DC, tried to figure out what to do afterwards, but highly recommend SFN and this department if you're interested in that. So they may have other offerings now. Along the way, just showing you a few other things because I wanted to point out some opportunities and ways to get involved. Nationally, with kind of stepping back for a second, going back to my involvement with the National Postdoc Association. Again, they advocate for postdoc policies. I was involved with the writing team on the advocacy committee. So this is one example of where if you have an area of policy you're interested in, you can join a society or association that may be working on that and get involved and volunteer with them. That really helped me to think about writing about policies related to postdocs through that committee. Because my background was in biochemistry, I joined the American Society for Cell Biology. This is, again, they may have student membership as well, but it's a good way to learn about what's going on in biomedical research. But also they have a public policy committee that I was on for almost 3 years, I think. Again, very helpful introduction and how a society really thinks about public policy in addition to SFN. This was before my SFN fellowship. And so that's another plug that if you're part of a society, it's a good way to learn policy related to that and learn from staff from the society about it. As was already mentioned, I'm currently a fellow with ARIS. This is more sort of a workforce project. So we're looking at policy training across the US, slightly different thing. But again, kind of keeping with the theme of connecting research and society, which is what I've been involved in and still pursuing that. Now that I'm in government relations, and I'll talk a little bit about my day job as well, but I joined one of the task forces. So this is a group of women leaders in the field. They have an education task force. It's another tip to get involved with groups that are in your field. So once you kind of figure out what field you want to be in, there's probably going to be some way to gain skills and leadership. This is a good group for that. And then locally, this is, I would recommend if you have a policy group at your school, You can start a group, you can start doing sort of local events. But for me, once I finished my fellowship, I joined the SFN chapter, the DC chapter, and I was on that for almost 3 years, I think, or 2 years, through a neuro policy committee. So locally, again, you can think about organizing policy events locally, which sometimes it's easier to do and more tangible if you're not in DC and you want to just learn about how to do this and how things work. You can organize sort of local events and so on. So that's another plug to sort of cultivate both national and local level experiences. I think is a good strategy. And again, there's probably some organization working on policy issues you may be interested in. So moving on to today, fast forward to this. So I've actually been here for 3 years now, almost to the day. Was lucky enough to get this position as a legislative analyst with the University of California system in DC. So a lot of, maybe not a lot of, but sort of the major universities have offices in DC that liaise between their constituents and researchers and policymakers in DC. So the job itself is very focused on the research portfolio. We advocate for the university with Congress, administration, and federal agencies. So what this means is obviously a lot of legislative analysis. This is really analyzing bills that impact university research, advocating for specific policies. The image I'm showing here is from a Coalition for National Science Funding. So they advocate for National Science Foundation funding that supports research for investigators and students. So we had quite a number of students in the meetings from campuses, and they met with Hill staff and talked about how NSF funding has supported their research. It was a really nice conversation, and they like to see, how they the funds that they advocate for are actually making a difference in the lives of students, and it was really nice to see that. So this is an example of something that we do quite often in advocacy for specific causes within research, and this is one where, again, was specific to NSF funding. We also meet with program directors of federal agencies. So again, sometimes there are grant opportunities that researchers will ask about, they want to hear more. And so we try to set up meetings for them to talk to directors from NSF again, to try and provide opportunities in terms of what new grants are happening or things coming out that they may not know about because they're in California. We may have a more direct connection. I already talked about the Capitol Hill visits and briefings, so I'll show you a couple of examples. But again, a lot of our job is essentially liaising between researchers on UC campuses and policymakers in DC. It's been virtual, obviously, for the past 2 years, so that'll change. And then finally addressing research needs and funding questions from campuses. So again, we try to be kind of the federal resource for any research grants that can apply to new things coming out, opportunities, things that their researchers can submit grants to. So I wanted to share then a couple of examples of, because this comes up a lot, about how do you impact policy? What does it mean to actually do something? Because these meetings are useful. We meet with Hill staff. It's hard to see sort of what the downstream impact is going to be of this work. So a few things that have been impactful during my time here, and a lot of this is tied to the pandemic. Obviously, things sort of shifted in research once COVID happened. But one example, this is something I like to talk about, this briefing where we had students and postdocs meet with Hill staff about, not Hill staff, it was basically a panel with trainees where Hill staff attended, and they talked about impacts of COVID on their life, their research, their mental health, basic needs, housing, and all sorts of stuff. So really trying to capture the impact of the pandemic on students and postdocs in the system was really nicely done, and it really resonated with Hill staff. in terms of, again, how they can help the next generation, what kind of grants we need and more funding and support for mental health and all this stuff. So this was a good project and I think it did make an impact. Other kinds of things you can do, and also I'm proud of this one. So in 2020, NSF was looking for information on their strategic plan, how they can improve things, what they can do better for the research enterprise. And so we submitted a paragraph, which you can see here, around the STEM workforce, together with other universities. So it was a joint sort of document organized by an association, and then this is the kind of thing they do, and this is kind of where that consensus building comes in that I brought up. You have a number of folks who are sending essentially a response to NSF about what the higher ed community thinks, how we should improve the workforce and their research and so on. And so I wrote this part. That was exciting, and now it's, NSF will be aware that this is something we think is important, and they'll hopefully use that as part of their plan. So it's another kind of impact that you are writing something to an agency that they'll maybe use in part of their strategic plan. Another, and this comes back to kind of my core role here in terms of legislation. So I also wanted to show you what this looks like. So it's been probably a couple of years now, but this was last June. There was a legislation circulating on the NSF to improve, again, NSF and the STEM pipeline. So one of the California legislators, Zoe Lofgren, proposed some amendments to the bill. So you can sort of see what this looks like here, because I wanted to show you kind of the legislative language. We included, essentially, this is a part of the bill that talks about why we need more mentoring and training, career training for students and postdocs. They didn't actually have postdocs in the bill, and so you can see basically we added that in. Very simple. It's a strike graduate student, insert postdoc. And then they also didn't have any options for professional development funding for postdocs. Again, this goes back to my way back to my original interest in training. And so we added this language on postdocs and including professional development funding. Okay. So this section, sorry about that, is again to include professional development funding for postdocs in the bill, which was really exciting. This is another kind of impact in that you can add legislative language into a bill that's circulating. And so you can see this at the link in the bottom here. This was exciting again because the bill actually is still moving now. But being able to actually have language in this bill is another kind of impact, and hopefully the bill will pass all the way. Again, it's been a year, it's still moving in Congress. That gives you an idea of how slow things are. But that's another sort of accomplishment and the way to impact something that you care about is to try and get some language in the legislation. So that's really it as far as sort of the overall field, my path. I do want to transition a little bit and tell you about the journal, which I also run, as was alluded to in the introduction. So JSPG, and also because it's a journal for students where you can submit your work, and so that may be of interest to you. So a little background. So JSPG is internationally recognized, open access, and peer-reviewed research publication. We're also a nonprofit. We publish early career policy work in policy. So it's really a lot of different topics. I'll show you in a second. We also do professional development, different workshops and webinars. We try to engage published authors in policymaking after publishing, so it's still a work in progress. But just to emphasize that while we are a policy journal, we also do a lot of kind of professional development and training in policy skills. Here's all the different formats we publish on, and so it is somewhat academic, but the format is different in terms of policy memos and op-eds, policy briefs, for example, things that a policymaker would actually read, but it is more rigorous in terms of being an actual policy paper. So then here you can see all the different topics we publish on. It's quite broad on purpose. You can see that on the website as well. And then wanted to share a few calls that we have right now. So the website is sciencepolicyjournal.org/submit. But this is 3 different types of calls we have right now. So we have both standard issues, which is general submissions on any topic, any format. This is the issue with NSPN at the bottom here. Deadline is in November, so it's somewhat themed around the election, but it's a broad issue that you can submit to. And we will have some events in terms of workshops and webinars for this as well. We have a special issue on open science due at the end of July, and then one about digital health, kind of how do we engage youth in thinking about the future of digital health, which is the deadline is in August. So we still have a few events coming up as far as workshops and webinars related to this, and all of them are on our YouTube channel also. So it's actually good content to subscribe to the channel if you want to learn about policy topics that we've already done, listen to the webinars that we have, but also we have a few things coming up still this summer into the fall related to these calls. So these are specific, again, the open science and digital health are specific topics. But then something like the NSPN issue is a standard where you can submit anything there. So a few ideas, and we've had a few other topics during the last few years too, but I wanted to bring this up now. And then, as I mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities for professional development. So webinars and workshops, again, we do this leading up to all of our submission deadlines, and they're on the YouTube channel, so I would subscribe to that. We have a few other opportunities. So this is, again, some of it is related to being a journal. So we have this associate editor role where students can submit or can apply to become part of the editorial board, which I will open tomorrow. This is something, again, you can look at the sciencepolicyjournal.org/careers. We welcome your application to the board, and it's a way to gain these skills in terms of peer review and so on. We also have an ambassador program, which it's currently closed, but it'll open again in next year. Probably we're piloting this year, but the goal is to sort of help promote published work through outreach communications, social media. We have a podcast and so on. And so it's a way to do something else other than the publishing itself, but learn how to promote things around that, which is a good skill in the field as well. So it's another option to apply for this. It'll be open again next year. But in the meantime, you can check out the website if you want to learn more. We also have the certificate program, which currently, again, it's not open, but will open in the fall probably, with UC Irvine, which is, again, open, virtual, free. We do have an application process, but it's essentially, we partnered with Irvine on the certificate program to teach policy skills and writing and pitching. We had panels with fellows talking about their career path and so on. So it's a good opportunity, again, for professional development, something you can do from home if you get accepted. And it's there are some deliverables at the end, like a writing piece, a pitching, sort of pitching your research and so on. So it's a good way to learn these skills. So stay tuned for that later in the year. Just a few other things to mention. So for published authors, as I said, we are a virtual journal, but We do try to elevate published work. And so a few things we've done, again, I mentioned the podcast, you can see here, this is one example, environmental policy. So we had a few authors published on this. We had a discussion. This is both video and audio. So again, another resource for you to listen to the podcast is a good way to learn about the publications. But also if you publish in the journal, you can be on the podcast, which is an incentive for people. We've had a few authors present to our partners. So we have international partners. In the bottom left here, you can see we had students present to the British Embassy virtually, which was interesting, but this is an example of something you can do as a published author. If the partners have the opportunities to speak somewhere, we try to provide that for authors. We do submit conference panels. Again, a lot of this has been virtual, but we do try to give authors opportunities to speak on published work. And then finally, media engagement, which is it's a work in progress, but this is also a good example. Graduate students at Northwestern published essentially this paper saying that we need to publish in more languages than English. So one thing, subsequently, we translated the paper into, I think, 6 languages. That's an option, but also Northwestern wrote this piece on them, interviewed the authors, and that was really nice to see. So hopefully we'll do more of this sort of highlighting of published work and the authors and their background and so on. That's a work in progress, but again, we try to be more than just a PDF on the website and really elevate the published work. So that's really about it. Hopefully I gave you some good opportunities today. I'm happy to talk more about the journal. Wanted to share a few resources here. So this is a good paper that came out in February from Kenny Gibbs. He has done a lot of work in this space. So he wrote this nice perspective on his career path from pipettes to policy. He works at NIH, I think, but he has a really interesting perspective on the field. So it's a good paper to read if you want to learn more about how other people transitioned. And then I would recommend a few scientific societies. Again, I put some here. AAAS is a good one to be involved in, SFN again, and also ASCB or something else that is discipline specific to your interests. There are a lot of societies and a good way to learn policy that way. Again, we encourage you to engage with the journal. We have a newsletter. I can send you the link to keep up to date with our events, issues, call for submissions, trainings, and other things we do. And then also the National Science Policy Network is another group to engage with who does trainings for early career scientists interested in policy. So that's it for me. I leave my contact here. Again, my website and LinkedIn, happy to connect there. I'm on Twitter, and I can send you my email as well, but it's also on the website. If you go to my contact information, it's there. It's also happy to chat more by email if you'd like to follow up on any of these things I discussed today. Thank you.
Dr. Bankston, thank you so much for that very informative talk. And it was really inspiring to hear your career path and just how much you've really worked on science policy. So thank you so much for taking the time to present here today. I ask all the audience now that if in the chat that if you would like to ask any questions, please do so now. But starting as a guiding question right now, Dr. Bankston, as you mentioned, a lot of these internships or research advocacy for science policy is mainly based in DC or in mainly urban areas. So what advice do you have for students that are really looking for science policy, but either do not have the resources to go to many nations' capitals or would like to do research in their local area?
Yeah, so what I mentioned already is a lot of universities have science policy groups you can get involved in. Actually, when I was at U of L, I think it was only for postdocs, but you can look at, if your school does have a policy group and join that, they often do events. And again, all these things are really useful, learning how to organize an event locally, bring panelists, A lot of times people will be doing state level work. So I would also encourage to, go to your state capital, talk to your local representatives. Everybody has a website. You can see kind of what they're interested in, and connect with them. Sometimes it's easier to do that locally. I think some of the kind of broader resources I mentioned, so JSPG, NSPN, all these societies, you can virtually engage with them. Although a lot of societies are also in DC, but there are ways to do those things, join committees and these kinds of things, which are virtual, and that's helpful to do. I would also say doing informational interviews. So, I get a lot of questions from students, and again, happy to chat with folks here about my transition, what things they can be doing. It's a good thing to do that when you're looking for jobs, but even before, if you just want to learn about what it's like to work in government, I talk to someone who's there. Again, I can provide sort of the university perspective. I would also encourage talking to people who work in other sectors, right? And then get an idea of what is it like day to day at NIH. What is it like to be at a society, right? I can speak to my SFN experience with people that do that sort of day to day. So, and then, find out how they transition, right? And then my story really is one example. But everybody has a different story, and you can, do that from home, right? Just ask for 30 minutes from somebody and say, how did you transition? Will you talk to me for 30 minutes? And most people are happy to do that. That's a good way to learn about different paths as well.
Yes, that's absolutely great advice. Thank you so much. Dr. Bankston, do you also have any right now recommendations for any possibly graduate students here that are now looking for employment in science policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think thinking back to my experience, I would say a lot of my sort of gaining skills has been through volunteering, which is why I keep going back to saying like volunteering with a society or organization, national organization is helpful, teaches them the skills. Still, the most common way to transition is through some sort of fellowship, which is PhD level. There's a few, this is something to look into. If you can get into the field through a master's in policy, for example. It wouldn't really work from just from college. There are actually very few fellowships now that transitioned from undergrad into policy, because most of them are geared towards PhDs who want to transition. That's just how the system is, and hopefully that'll change. I think more things are popping up. But I think there are also examples of people that have done enough sort of volunteering that they can apply for an entry-level position like an analyst. But still, the fellowships are still the best way to transition. And I can send a link to this, but again, a lot of them are PhD level. So if you are in grad school interested in or want to graduate, then it is there's a lot of fellowships for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bankston. And we have a question from our audience. They ask, this is a very broad question, but in your perspective, working in science policy, what do you see as the future of it 10 to 20 years out from today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, what I would like to see is more young people involved. I think this is a trend. I can sort of speak to this from the federal standpoint that there is sort of this movement to engage young people in policy. Like we've sort of done this through panels and getting really the student perspectives to talk to Hill staff, because that connection isn't there. But young people, bring really new perspectives that they need to hear about and what they're going through. This is sort of a trend popping up now because there's more science policy groups across the US universities. There is, again, an effort from universities to engage students in these panels. Hopefully we'll see more of that. I think there'll be more opportunities. Even societies are developing more options and ways for them to get involved and come to DC through these Capitol Hill days and so on. So, well, it's hard to speak to this, I think, at a specific level because a lot of it depends on the administration, right? So what's happening in the Biden administration was different from Trump. And the things that we looked at and worked on is very dependent on that, federally at least. But that's what I would say. I would encourage you to get involved as you can locally or through some of these national groups, because I think we're moving towards more young participation of young people in the field and kind of shaping the future is kind of where things are going. And so it's a good time to engage now. And again, happy to chat more specifics if you're interested in specific areas or groups you're looking for, organizations you want to work with, or I can probably suggest some. I'll share my email as well for that.
Yes, absolutely. No, that was actually really informational and just giving your perspective on just seeing how things are going. And especially mentioning that, as time changes, so does science policy, depending on what, just how governments come in, what science is going on and things like that. And with that question being said, this question is also kind of a follow-up, but in your experience of science policy, well, this is a double question. Have you in your experience worked with scientists that may be conducting their own research and wanting to advocate for it? And if so, are there any difficulties that you see right now in getting research that may be clinical or medical based or even laboratory based to now getting it to the policy level where there might be some gaps in communication, some gaps in understanding, and in some retrospect to that area?
Yeah. So to the connection, like I said, in my position is very much like you're kind of the middle person between researchers and policymakers, kind of back and forth. We do help faculty advocate for what they work on. Students a lot of times do it like they're really interested in the policy area that may or may not be related to their research, right? So they may be doing biomedical research, but they want to do maybe mental health policy, and so they publish on that. And this is kind of where the journal can fit into, where publishing a paper on a policy topic can actually help move your career in that direction if you want to move away from your research into something else that you want to study and build your policy career on that. It can be a different topic. So I think in terms of, from my point of view, government relations offices are a good way to engage, and because that's basically what we do, we're sort of in the middle of that. Again, go back to societies, because a lot of them have these Capitol Hill days, and that's basically what they are. It's a day of advocacy on a specific topic. What we were doing, what I showed the CNSF, that was NSF funding. But there's people that advocate for climate change policy. We do have engineering days, going to the medical side of things. There's a lot of advocacy for public hospitals, for example, or medical topics. Again, the healthcare side is sort of tricky, but again, there are organizations that do that, like the AMC, specific organizations or societies, again, that advocate for more healthcare issues. That's a little more removed from my area, but still overlap. To the question of whether there are obstacles or how to kind of communicate that, I think a lot of advocacy comes down to kind of strategy and knowing which legislators will be receptive, which does develop over time. We have a few legislators that we know will support our cause because they've worked with us before. So it kind of comes down to this question of who do you go to for specific areas? we kind of know who's supportive of, clinical research and things like that. So it's kind of a strategy there. But there are ways to kind of get your point across to them.
Yes, absolutely. That also brings up a great point for one of our audience members, Francine, who asks, with all the experience that you're describing, what do you feel is the most useful thing you learned about science policy so far?
That's a broad question. Yeah. It's interesting when you start getting into the field, because science policy really means a lot of things. I think you have to kind of figure out what that means for you, right? And so for me, coming from the academic life, all of my policy is centered around sort of university, higher education, empowering students in the field, and so on. And so I think it can be overwhelming when you're first starting out. And like I showed you, sort of there's different places to do policy. The day-to-day is not the same depending on where you work. And so, don't be intimidated of when you talk to somebody about it, because it can really be a number of things. But I would say, and this is what I learned, is kind of finding a topic area that you're interested in, kind of building your policy portfolio around that can help you transition, because it can be daunting to try and transition from research into policy. Yeah, and then also it's a small world actually, because you kind of end up seeing the same people here everywhere. Before the pandemic, there were a lot of receptions in DC, and so I think that's something you learn as you're getting to know people in the field, that it's somewhat overwhelming when you first transition, but then you realize that it's kind of a small world and everyone knows everyone. So it's a good field to be in. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Bankston, and for all the questions that you've answered during this session. It was really insightful to hear from you about science policy and to see people like you working in this field and really trying to make an impact in many people's lives. So thank you for all the work that you do. To our audience members, if you have any final questions, you may ask them. But if not, Dr. Bankston, thank you so much for attending this session and being part of NeuroCon. This was really an exciting session, and we really hope our audience got some great knowledge from this and will use it in their next future careers. So I'll ask the audience now to give your thank yous and applauses for Dr. Bankston. And to Dr. Bankston, again, thank you so much for coming. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me here, and I'll send you the slides as well. And again, happy to chat more one-on-one if people want to reach out after.